Fáilte rómh léir chuig léirlinn ó scáil Maynooth ar an ócéid tábhachtach seach, agus cé bhfuil áthas ó chríorm ghuilimid an go léir an seo le haid calúra ach an arm céin is Queen and Ken agus an gcónaí nine agus an eagar uafásach go hála dóibh agus dá deaglach. You're all very welcome today to Maynooth University Library on this important occasion, and while I am delighted that we're all here again to celebrate his great work, at the same time we remember Ken and the Ogoni Nine and the terrible injustice that they and their families suffered. I'm particularly glad to welcome Sister Magella and her colleagues from her congregations and the Communications Office and the Justice Officer. You're very welcome. Maynooth University is delighted and indebted to Feroze, our publisher, for his valued contribution and ongoing dedication to preserving Ken Saro-Wiwa's legacy, and we're delighted he's here today as our keynote speaker. I'm delighted we have the Ken Saro-Wiwa Poetry Prize winner from Maynooth Education Campus with us today, Conor. You're very welcome, Conor, and Conor's parents. And I want to thank their teacher, Noel Ryan, in particular, for his enthusiastic support and engagement of this project. I know it's very, very difficult these days to get kids in and out of schools and to get them engaged in these kind of things, so we're particularly grateful to Noel for all his work on that, so thank you again, Noel. I'm also delighted to welcome people from Trócaire. Trócaire are very much part of the Ogoni story. Trócaire provided funding and other resources for the relief efforts after the Ogoni villages were destroyed, and were very active during the campaign in the efforts to save the lives of the Ogoni Nine, although unfortunately, as we all know, that was unsuccessful. Trócaire also helped fund the publication of the first edition of Silence Will Be Treason. Just before I hand over to Helen, and you all know, I think Helen's vital role in this process, I'm obliged to remind you of the fire exits, which in the unlikely event of an emergency are to my right. The first one is just immediately to my right, and the second one is just past the poster exhibition. So if you do hear the fire alarm, please make your way to those and follow the guidance of anyone wearing a lanyard like this. Okay, so I'm now delighted to hand over to my colleague, Deputy Librarian Helen Fallon.
Thank you, Cathal. I'd like to start by thanking all my library colleagues who today was a real team effort, and really in the last couple of months they have really contributed so much to today. And I see Evelyn Conlon has arrived. Welcome, Evelyn. Evelyn is a writer who was involved in the campaign to save the Ogoni Nine, and in fact she's in our archive. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, Evelyn. There's a photograph of you protesting on the street. So, it's been a busy time since Sister Magella McCarran donated her collection of material relating to Ken Saro-Wiwa to Maynooth University in November 2011. So it's one of the highlights of the library's ever-growing, unique and distinctive collections. And it's wonderful to see how it has been integrated into the teaching and research activity of the university and utilised by scholars and activists nationally and internationally. Departments across our three faculties now draw on these treasures and our excellent library staff as part of a range of modules from maths to medieval Irish. Ken Saro-Wiwa's daughter, the renowned travel writer No, came to us in 2015 to view the collection of letters her father wrote, and she read from her work to a large audience here. On that visit, she was interviewed by Dr. Anne O'Brien for the Ken Saro-Wiwa Audio Archive, a collaboration between Maynooth University and Kairos Communication, which resulted in an innovative open access sound archive, which you can read more about in the new edition of Silence Would Be Treason. On her 2015 visit, Noor presented the inaugural Maynooth University Ken Saro-Wiwa Postgraduate Award to History PhD student Graham Kay. His PhD thesis explores the relationship between government and the international oil industry in the lead up to the First World War. And he used the bursary to fund research in archives and libraries in Germany. We had our first international exhibition of material from the collection at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut in 2016. And we're currently planning a Ken Saro-Wiwa travelling exhibition across Ireland in conjunction with Irish Public Libraries. It starts in Kildare in January and it'll move to Dublin after that. Last year at our Saro-Wiwa Seminar, Mark Dummett from Amnesty International London briefed the audience on the key findings of Amnesty's International 2017 report on Shell's activity in the Niger Delta. Unfortunately, Mark couldn't be with us this morning, but if you weren't here last year, it's all on the library's YouTube channel, and it is still very current with all that's going on in Ogoni. And we had a very exciting development last month. The university's legal representatives, Feroz Manji, our publisher who's here, and the library completed negotiation to allow material in Silence Would Be Treason to be used by an American filmmaker who visited the library earlier in the year to view the collection as part of development work on behalf of Sony Pictures. During that visit, he also met with Sister Magella McCarran. This is very exciting news, and revenues from the initiative will be used towards the Ken Saro-Wiwa bursary. Shortly, Sister Magella McCarran will present a wonderful Samsung Galaxy tablet to the winner of the Ken Saro-Wiwa poetry competition, an initiative between the University Library and the Maynooth Education Campus, where transition year students engaged with the collection here in the library, had poetry workshops here, facilitated by poet Jessica Traynor, and subsequently wrote poems on the topic Eco-Hero. Jessica can't be here today, but she sent me the following text in response to the poetry competition as a whole and the entries, the many entries we received. And these are Jessica's words, not mine. I was so happy to see how the students had responded to the theme of global pollution and answered Ken Saro-Wiwa's call to become eco-heroes in their own right. We had a number of really passionate pleas to turn back the tide of pollution and a real sense of awareness of the damage that has been done to the earth. The part that human greed has to play in pollution of the planet is also clearly expressed in these poems. The students aren't afraid to try out form, and I was delighted to read a number of haiku and also poems that showed real imaginative flair, where the writer has placed themselves in the shoes of another speaker and really channeled their experiences. These poems transport the readers to faraway places and imbue them with an urge to change things for the better. I hope all the writers will continue to write in future. There is so much potential here. So I'm delighted to announce Conor Walsh, transition year student, Maynooth Education Campus, won first prize in the Ken Saro-Wiwa School Poetry Competition. And I'm delighted Conor is here with his parents, Patricia and John. And I will now call on Sister Magella to present Conor with his prize. And after that, Conor will read his winning poem. No, you don't. No, you want to listen to our poem now, then I'll be back up.
Later on. 1859. Standing there at the side of the drill, watching the oil, black as coal, being poured into the container. Seeing Mr. Drake's face as he watched on, the pride clearly evident. It was simply magnificent. Thinking of what heroes we were, how the world will change because of us, the legacy that we will leave behind. We rushed to tell them what we had found, how different their reaction was to what I had envisaged. We were not glorified heroes, we were monsters. They told us, if used, this oil would be the death of the human race. Sitting here now, thinking that we almost damaged the earth in an unthinkable fashion, I am comforted in the knowledge that we will always remember the dark day when oil tried to kill us. We must take the lessons learned from that day and allow them to influence everything we do. The mistakes of that day must never be made again, because if they are, the consequences will be grave.
Whoa.
Thank you very much, Conor. And this is what Jessica Traynor, the poet, had to say about your poem. This is a really imaginative take on the idea of global pollution, a unique historical take focusing on Edwin Drake's striking oil in 1859. I think that the poet has been very clever in going back, in a sense, to the source of our current problems and creating a very dramatic and ominous atmosphere, foreshadowing the troubles that the reader knows will come. The poet does a really good job of evoking the voice of the oil worker who slowly discovers the ruin their discovery will wreak on humanity. This poem shows a passionate engagement with the subject and a lively imagination. A very impressive poem and a well-deserved first prize. So, well done. We do have a second and third prize and two runners-up, but they're calling in later and they will just be presented with their prizes. They're getting book tokens. So I will now call on our guest speaker, Feroz Manji. We are very fortunate to have Feroz with us today. And of course, he's the publisher of Silence Would Be Treason. But in addition to that, he has more than 40 years' experience in international development, health, human rights, and political organising. He is the publisher of Daraja Press and founder and former editor-in-chief of the Pan-African Social Justice newsletter and website Pambazuka News and Pambazuka Press. Originally a dentist and researcher in public health, he was CEO for the Aga Khan Foundation UK, directed Amnesty International's Africa programme and worked with the Council for the Development of Social Sciences Research in Africa. He has published widely on health, social policy, human rights and political sciences, and authored and edited a wide range of books on social justice in Africa. Welcome, Feroz.
Thank you and good afternoon. How do I follow a poem like that? Many congratulations. Thank you for having invited me to participate in this, and I'm going to throw some ideas and thoughts at you about what I think are the centrality of culture in the struggle for a new world, drawing on the ideas of Amilcar Cabral and Ken Saro-Wiwa. There are two events in my life which had a profound impact on my thinking and my politics. One was the assassination of Amilcar Cabral on 20th January 1973, and the other was the assassination of Ken Saro-Wiwa on November 10th, 1995. When Cabral was assassinated, I was at university in England and active in the solidarity movement on the Portuguese colonies, the movements for freedom in the Portuguese colonies. His writings were subsequently to transform my thinking about the nature of colonialism, to transform my ideas about what it means to struggle for liberation, emancipation, and freedom. And I was to discover later on that he was assassinated and gunned down by his own comrades. Betrayals always come from within. And when the Abacha regime in Nigeria killed Ken Saro-Wiwa and his colleagues, I was the Africa director at Amnesty International at their headquarters in London. I remember how completely helpless and outraged I was Here I was, head of the Africa program of the world's largest human rights organization, and yet we had failed to prevent this crime. We had appealed to Western governments, as well as to African governments, to intervene forcefully for the release of Ken, but had been met with responses such as quiet diplomacy will do the trick, not overt criticism, they said. Sanctions and so on would not succeed. A response, unfortunately, also that came from the recently newly elected South African government. And I should just point out that at that time, the ANC's headquarters was in Shell House in Johannesburg. That experience was to transform my thinking about the meaning of neocolonialism, the complicity of transnational corporations, and the degree to which our governments have become increasingly beholden to the corporations. The two events helped me understand the continuities between colonialism and neocolonialism. The first, the product of liberalism, the second, of neoliberalism. So you can imagine how delighted I was to be approached by our colleagues at Maynooth to help publish Silence Would Be Treason, the last writings of Ken Saro-Wiwa, at the time that I was editing and about to publish an anthology on Amilcar Cabral called Claim No Easy Victories, The Legacy of Amilcar Cabral. So these two events came together at that moment. And of course, I couldn't say no. This was an obligation not only to Maynooth, an obligation to myself to get over the pains of failure that I had experienced at Amnesty. But before continuing, I would like to acknowledge here the efforts of the solidarity movements in Ireland and of Sister Magella, who during Ken Saro-Wiwa's lifetime and imprisonment provided him with a much needed sustenance. And since his assassination, have, together with Maynooth Library, helped to keep him alive. I want to share some thoughts, as I said, about the commonalities between Cabral and Ken Saro-Wiwa, especially in relation to culture and the centrality of culture for the struggle of freedom. I don't know whether many of you knew of or know of Amilcar Cabral. Very briefly, he was the founder of and the leader of the Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde Liberation Movement, PAIGC. A remarkable individual, a revolutionary, a humanist, a poet, a military strategist, and a prolific writer on revolutionary theory, culture, and liberation. The struggles he led against the Portuguese colonialism contributed to the collapse of the Portuguese African Empire, as well as to the collapse of the fascist regime in Portugal itself during the revolutions of 1974-75. Unfortunately, these were events that he was not to witness himself, since he was assassinated in 1973. Cabral and Saro-Wiwa were separated by a number of years and by two different eras. The one involving the struggle for independence in Africa, the other dealing with the consequences of the failures of independence and the rise of neoliberalism. There were continuities, however, between these two eras. Quote, Cabral and Saro-Wiwa sit together in this transformative and unfinished space, says Helen Fallon, asking questions that remain important in Ireland as in Africa. But despite this separation of years and of eras, they had much in common. Both sought self-determination for their own people. Both were clear that self-determination, not secession, was what they were fighting for. And I think these two concepts, self-determination and secession, often get confused and are considered synonymous. And I'd argue they are not. Self-determination is about the struggle for justice, dignity, and an attempt to establish a universalist and inclusive humanity. Whereas secession, by definition, is an act of exclusion, of defining others, defining oneself by excluding others. The tragedy for Saro-Wiwa was that the struggle for self-determination for the Ogoni came in the wake of the Biafran War of Secession, the leadership of which Saro-Wiwa was very critical. The struggle of the Ogoni people for self-determination could easily come to be seen, and indeed was seen, as a continuation of the secessionist movement, despite Saro-Wiwa's insistence against secession, although sometimes in his writings he was a bit ambiguous about the distinction. While Cabral and Saro-Wiwa were clearly exceptional individuals, we have to recognize it was the movements in which they were involved and which they helped to create that the credit must go for organizing and for endeavoring to give birth to a new world. We often characterize such movements as being expressions of resistance. But I think we need to change that perception. To draw on Michel Alexander's recent article in the New York Times, we are not the resistance. These movements were not the resistance. On the contrary, they sought to establish and give birth to a new world, just as the anti-fracking and environmental movements in Ireland and the free, safe, legal abortion campaign following the pro-choice vote in the May's referendum here in Ireland, all are about seeking to give birth to a new world. We need to insist that it is the state and the corporations that are the resistance, not us. Not those who are giving birth to or struggling to give birth to a new world. And it was the Portuguese colonial regimes and the Abacha neo-colonial regime in collaboration with Shell that were the resistance to the efforts of the movements of both PAIGC and MOSOP that were seeking to give birth. Giving birth is always an act involving the struggle to overcome the violence of resistance. This is as true of the seedling emerging from the ground as it is for the child being born. All genuine movements, I would argue, all genuine movements for freedom don't just choose the path of violence, but they always face the violence of those that resist the world they are giving birth to. And in some cases, there is no choice but to use military means to defend the gains that have been made. The struggle to give birth to Ireland was met with fierce, violent, and I'd argue terrorist resistance by the British state. They, not us, are the resistance. In Guinea-Bissau, PAIGC created liberated zones at the time of which at the time of Cabral's assassination covered some 2/3 of the country. There, we found completely new structures of popular democracy. The Portuguese currency was abolished and a system of barter exchange was established. Women played leading roles in political decision-making, and the rekindling of culture and pride in their own histories, languages, stories, and music flourished. New health and education and other services were established universally for everyone there. They were creating a new world, but they had no choice to ensure the movement had the means to defend the new society that had been built. So PIGC, although it's often referred to as a guerrilla movement, was not about promoting violence, but of defending the birth of a new society from the genocidal violence of Portuguese imperialism. Both Cabral, at the hands of his own comrades, those who were to become the neo-colonial rulers of the future, and Saro-Wiwa, at the hands of the neo-colonial Abacha regime, paid the ultimate sacrifice for their audacity to both think and create in their time a new world. This is what distinguishes them from so many others. It was not only having a dream that another world was possible, but having the courage to create that world immediately today. It was that which presented such a threat to those who resisted that birth. I make this point because it is in the crucible of struggle that real culture evolves as a weapon of liberation, a point that, as I will show shortly, both Cabral and Saro-Wiwa make. To be able to subject millions of humans to the barbarism of enslavement, slavery, and colonial domination required defining them as non-humans or less than humans, and so required a systematic dehumanization of those populations. That process required a systematic and institutionalized attempt at the destruction of existing cultures, languages, histories, and capacities to produce, to organize, to tell stories, to invent, to love, to make music, sing songs, make poetry, produce art, philosophize, and formulate in their minds that which they imagine before they give it concrete form. All those things that define a human. This attempt to destroy the culture of Africans, points out Cabral, turned out to be a signal failure. For while colonialism destroyed the institutions of the continent, the memories of their culture, institutions, art forms, music, and all that which is associated with being human remained both on the continent and in the diaspora where these enslaved Africans found themselves. The enslavers, the slave owners, and all those who profited from the horrors, including the emerging capitalist classes of Europe, engage in a systematic recasting of human beings as non-humans, a process in which the Christian Church and the European intelligentsia were deeply involved. Whatever the material aspects of domination, quote, it can be maintained only by the permanent and organized repression of the cultural life of the people concerned, wrote Cabral. The use of violence to dominate a people is, above all, to take up arms to destroy, or at least to neutralize and to paralyze their cultural life. For as long as part of that people have a cultural life, foreign domination cannot be assured of its perpetuation. Such experiences must surely ring bells here in Ireland, whose experience of seeking freedom had so much in common with those that Africans experienced. Famine, dispossession, displacement, attempts to silence song, language, enslavement, and exile from their lands. All those things must surely resonate for you. For Saro-Wiwa, the advent of British colonialism was to shatter Ogoni society and inflict on us a backwardness from which we are still struggling to escape. It was British colonialism, he said, which forced alien administrative structures on us and herded us into the domestic colonialism of Nigeria. As a result of domestic colonialism, the Ogoni people have virtually lost pride in themselves and their ability, have voted for the multiplicity of parties in elections, have regarded themselves as perpetual clients of other ethnic groups, have come to think that there is nowhere else to go but down. Yes, we merely exist, barely exist, he wrote. Culture, wrote Cabral, is the product of this history, just as a flower is the product of a plant. Like history, or because it is history, culture has at its material base the level of the productive forces and the mode of production. Culture, he says, plunges its roots into the physical reality of the environmental humus in which it develops and reflects the organic nature of the society. You'd never guess he was an agronomist, would you? Culture, insists Cabral, is intimately linked to the struggle for freedom. While culture comprises many aspects, it grows deeper through the people's struggle and not through songs, poems, and folklore. One cannot expect African culture to advance, he said, unless one contributes realistically to the creation of the conditions necessary for this culture, i.e., the liberation of the continent. In other words, culture is not static and unchangeable, and it advances only through engagement in the struggle for freedom. I think, particularly speaking at a university, it's important to point out that many people think that one has to think before one acts. But the reality in life is, it is only through the engagement in struggle that one learns how to think. And it's somewhat counterintuitive to the usual academic approaches. To fight for national culture, echoes Frantz Fanon, first of all means fighting for the liberation of the nation, the tangible matrix from which culture can grow. One cannot divorce the combat for culture from the people's struggle for liberation. National culture, he says, takes form and shape during the fight, in prison, facing the guillotine, and in the capture and destruction of the French military positions. National culture is no folklore. It is the collective thought process of a people to describe, justify, and extol the actions whereby they have joined forces and remained strong. Saro-Wiwa's identity as a member of the Ogoni people, along with his political activism, is inseparable from the content of his novels. For example, in Sozaboy, Saro-Wiwa is clear about the political role of his work. Literature, he says, in a critical situation such as Nigeria's, cannot be divorced from politics. Literature must serve society. Writers must play an interventionist role. And as a result of this belief, Sozaboy possesses this sense of urgency and an articulation of what the nature of Nigeria was. He becomes a martyr who transcribes the struggles of the Ogoni people in the creation of the fictional Dukana people. The television series Bassi and Company, for example, targeted not just corrupt individuals, but rather Nigeria's culture of cheating as a whole. The writer cannot be a mere storyteller, he writes. He cannot merely x-ray society's weaknesses, its ills, its perils. He or she must be actively involved, shaping its present and its future. The most important thing for me, he writes, is that I've used my talents as a writer to enable the Ogoni people to confront their tormentors. I was not able to do it as a politician or as a businessman. My writing did it, and it sure makes me feel good. I'm mentally prepared for the worst, but hopeful for the best. I think I have the moral victory. Saro-Wiwa believed that literature is a critical situation in Nigeria and cannot be divorced from politics. For a member of a community that produced billions of dollars of oil wealth, but whose members themselves never had access to electricity, clean drinking water, and so on, he writes, you must go into activism, because if you're not into activism, then you are irresponsible. Silence, in other words, would indeed be treason. Saro-Wiwa, like Cabral before him, believed that the writer must take part in mass organizations and establish direct contact with the people. What they, the authorities, cannot stand, writes Saro-Wiwa, is that a writer should additionally give voice to the voiceless and organize them for action. In short, they do not want literature on the streets, and that is where, in Africa, it must be. The most important thing for me, he says, is that I've used my talents as a writer to enable the Ogoni people to control their tormentors. Furthermore, I've examined myself very closely to see how, in writing and reading in English, had actually colonized my mind. I am, I find, he says, an Ogoni as ever. I'm enmeshed in Ogoni culture. I devour Ogoni food. I sing Ogoni songs. I danced to Ogoni music. I find the best in the Ogoni worldview as engaging as anywhere and anything else. I'm anxious to see Ogoni establish themselves in Nigeria and make their contribution to world civilization. I myself am contributing to Ogoni life as fully and possibly even more effectively than those of Ogoni who do not speak or write English. The fact that I appreciate Shakespeare, Dickens, Chaucer, Hemingway, and so on, the fact that I know something of European civilization, its history and philosophy, the fact that I enjoy Mozart and Beethoven, is this a colonization of my mind? I cannot exactly complain about it. And I think the really important point that he's making here is the point I raised earlier on, that the struggle for self-determination, the struggle for freedom, is a universalist one. It's an inclusive one. It doesn't exclude others. So that Ogoni literature is enriched by literature from all over the world. And literature beyond Ogoni ought to be also influenced by the richness of Ogoni culture. Historically, the Ogoni people have always been fierce and independent, he writes. They have been known to display an exceptional achievement in their original abstract masks. As storytellers and in other forms of art, the Ogoni are gifted and hold their own easily. The Ogoni have made contributions of the first order to modern African literature in English. We must put the interests of our people higher, wrote Cabral, in the context of the interests of humankind in general. And then we can put them in the context of the interests of Africa in general. We must have the courage to state this clearly, he said. No one should think that the culture of Africa, what is really African, and so must be preserved for all time, for us to be Africans, is a weakness in the face of nature. Indeed, says Saro-Wiwa, literature must serve society by steeping itself in politics, by intervention. Writers must not merely write to amuse or to take a bemused critical look at society. They must play an interventionist role. He must take part in mass organizations, says Saro-Wiwa. He must establish direct contact with the people and resort to the strength of African literature, oratory in the tongue. For the world's power and more powerful is it when expressed in common currency. That is why a writer who takes part in mass organizations will deliver his message more effectively than one who writes waiting for time to work its literary wonders. The reconversion of minds, of mental set, is thus indispensable to the true integration of people into the liberation movement, wrote Cabral. Such reconversion, re-Africanization in our case, may take place before the struggle, but it is only complete during the course of the struggle through daily contact with the popular masses in the communion of sacrifice required by the struggle. I have myself just returned from a few days in South Africa, where I was a jurist on the Permanent People's Tribunal on the role of transnational corporations in Southern Africa. We received testimony from the DRC, from Madagascar, South Africa, Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and so on. The stories we heard recounted over and over and over again the culture of impunity, the destructive extraction of natural resources with no benefit for local populations, the collusion of our governments in the reaping of super profits and theft by transnational corporations, and the systematic attempts to destroy culture through land grabbing, dispossession, and displacement. For knowledge of and connection with the land is the heart of the people's history and culture. What took place with Shell and the Ogoni people is not unique. It is the general rule today across the continent. As both Cabral and Saro-Wiwa emphasize, culture is not a mere artifact or expression of aesthetics, custom, or tradition. It is a means by which people assert their opposition to domination, a means to proclaim and invent their inhumanity, a means to assert agency and the capacity to make history. In a word, culture is one of the fundamental tools of the struggle for emancipation. The efforts of Sister Majella and the Maynooth University Library to bring these writings together and make them available to the world is an inspiring cultural act with which Daraja Press is honored to be associated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Feroze. We're both sharing the microphone so that it can be this has been recorded. There is time for questions and comments to Feroze. I know myself, there's so much in that, and it's been so rich listening to it. Thank you very much on behalf of all of us. It really was tremendous. And I know the audience will be pleased to know Feroze has agreed to give us the text of his talk, and it will be available on the Maynooth University Library Treasures blog, hopefully in another week or two. So thank you for that. I'll throw the floor open, floor open for questions. And if you'd like to identify yourself, perhaps. Yes, Joe. Thank you.
Hello, how are you? John Negiti. I'm with Sister Majella. I was very taken with the idea of the revolutionaries, as they're called, not being the resistance, but the imperialists being the resistance. And of course it makes sense because they're the status quo. They're the one resisting the new development. that's one, just a comment. But a question for you, or something just if you could speak to. The idea of, centrally you're saying culture being the thing that gives birth to the new vision of the world. And I was just thinking as you're talking about the idea that we had the Gaelic revival, obviously, and that fed directly into our struggle for independence. But at the beginning of the Gaelic revival, you have, say, the likes of Lady Gregory, looking back to the old traditional culture. But then there's a moment where it becomes transformative, and you've got the likes of Sean O'Casey or James Singh coming out with these works of art, these works of literature and plays that are not simply nice little artifacts of the past, but they're challenging the society. And maybe you could speak to that in the context of what was going on in Nigeria.
Yeah, I think those are two really important points. But I think, let's be clear, it's not just the revolutionaries. It is all of us in our struggles. We have to look at what we're doing not as putting the stakes in the ground and trying to hold off. We're trying to give birth to a new world. If we're not doing that, what are we doing? And it is they who are resisting us because they fear the new world, which will be a democratic one, which will recognize people's diversity, which allows multiple perspectives and a richness, a way in which we interact with each other as humans. And that is, I think, one of the difficulties I've had in recent years is that so much of our politics is oppositional as opposed to propositional. If we turn this round and say, you are the resistance, it changes how we want to act. It changes what we want to do. And I think culture itself, I think the point you make about the emergence of Gaelic culture in Ireland, of course it has to have its roots in the past. But history is more about the future than it is about the past. We have to understand, history is a way of looking at the world to define the kind of world we want to build. And so we can't ignore it, but it emerges in struggles. It evolves in struggles. The songs, the best songs are ones which speak to the heart, which speak to some passion for a better world, in my view. And I think that's something really important to recognize, and for me it's remarkable being in Ireland, just from my little knowledge of the history of Ireland, how much we have in common in terms of the struggles across the African continent. You were slaves before we were. It's really clear. You look at the literature, you look at the history. It was the Irish, first the Slavs, that's the word slaves, then the Irish. Unfortunately, when you went across to North America, you became white, which is a shame, because then you became our supervisors as slaves. But don't forget that history, that was what they tried to do to you. And I think the successes that have emerged, you've still got to work to do about the colony up north, but I leave that to you. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Your presentation was very inspiring. I listened quite and followed you. Especially changing that paradigm makes a lot of sense to me. That the imperatives are truly the resistance and not we. But it's an aspect that I would like you to speak more on, and that is the aspect of activism, the possibility of activism being devoid of violence. Because if I followed you well, it appeared as if people are able to succeed in creating the new world because of the resistance, violence necessarily becomes a part of the struggle. And if we adopt that to an extent, there's a danger I feel is potent, and the way out of it is what I'm trying to ask. Because terrorism as we have it now is justified by those who engage in it based on this principle. They argue. They make it appear as if their culture has been bastardized. They are fighting to create a new world of their own idea. And because they've not been able to achieve that through other means, the only language they think that those, like we have defined now, the resistance is violence, which they have taken to another extreme now, and the whole world is thinking of how to deal with today. So could you speak better more on that? Thanks.
I think that's raised a really, really important issue. I'm not convinced that those who are labeled terrorists have actually demonstrated or shown what the new world that they are creating. It's not something that you have in your mind that tomorrow I will create it. People like Cabral and Saro-Wiwa acted in their day-to-day life to create that new world. They said, the future is today. They tried to do that. Now, we can't talk about the birth of a child being violent. It's not an act of violence. But there is, in that very process, a violence of resistance, which some women don't survive. And I think we have to, my point here is that we have to create positively today the world we want to live in. But in doing so, let us not be naive that there will be those who will want to destroy us. And we need to be prepared to defend ourselves in whatever way we can. It doesn't necessarily have to be the act of violence, of the use of guns or whatever. All these are romantic ideas. But in Guinea-Bissau, I mean, there was genocidal violence. People, the level of killings that these Portuguese carried out on a day-to-day basis. I mean, how long can you carry on doing that? How long before you say, no, this must stop? And Cabral was a military genius in that sense, because he actually understood people. He knew how to organize. And it is organizing that is the most effective way of preventing the violence of the resistors. But we have to be constantly aware that they are, look, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Syria, maybe Iran tomorrow, Libya, Cote d'Ivoire, you name it. They are resisting all kinds of things. They are carrying out acts of violence of most appalling. The real terrorists are in the State House. The real terrorists are across the waters in London. These are the terrorists, them and the transnationals. They are the terrorists because they have no other cause than to be able to keep things as they are. And I think we have to organize, being prepared that we may well face that resistance, but it is organizing, not violence, that is the solution forward, I would argue.
Thank you, and let me also appreciate your talk. It was superb. Now, I'm a bit confused, and I think you will clear that for me. As an African, I love to really appreciate my Africanness. I belong, therefore I'm an African. That is culture. And if we go back to looking at what the nationalists at least did in Africa, for independence to come to Africa, that was excellent. Now challenging what colonialism really was doing to the African culture. Now, that was the one weapon, I think, from my own research, that colonialism used in destroying whatever they've been able to destroy and continue to destroy in Africa. Now, it's been handed over. We have our own, you mentioned about Abacha, you mentioned about Cabral in Guinea-Bissau. We have African leaders now who perpetuate what we saw during colonialism. And when we begin to talk about agitation now in our context, I'm just back from Ogoni, and it's complex. Now, if our own people, leaders, are using the same style so that they get what they want for themselves, and I think nicely destroying the culture, and having young people denying their own culture. Of course, we will look at it also from the point of view of identity politics. Now, leaders getting people they think are from their own path in social movement and not allowing that to go on. Now, how do you reconcile that? As an African, you see, this is really the one thing that makes me an African and that brings value to whatever that we must really appreciate. But then it's the same thing that is being used by, I want to use your word now, tormentors, to kill us. Why should I continue to really be proud of my Africanness when I am the beholder now and still nothing changes? It's really getting worse.
Okay, I'll try and give you a short answer on this, but I mean, okay, the story goes like this, okay? Before the 16th century, before the 15th century, there was no such thing as an African, okay? There were lots of different societies. Nobody thought of themselves as African. The word African was a European construct. It was created to have a collective word to identify people they thought were non-human, okay? Therefore could be enslaved, could be tortured, could be killed, could be disposed of, could be used as chattel, as property. That was what they did. That was what an African was. In the French Revolution, after the Thermidor, those people in France, those people in Paris who argued that France should not return to slavery, that France should not return to colonialism, they were denounced as Africans. Okay? So, African was a political definition, not a geographic one or a racial one, okay? But just like the gay movement appropriated the word gay, the queer movement appropriated the word queer, originally a word of denouncing them, they appropriated it as their own. So Africans, in the struggle against colonialism, appropriated the word African as something positive. It was intimately linked and defined as a people who were struggling against colonialism, who were seeking to build a new world, who were finding new ways of organizing, the Pan-African Congress and so on. So long as being African had an intimate connection with the struggle for emancipation, that's what it became. And that's why we were proud to be African. And then what happened? At independence, the nationalists said, okay, enough. What you need is development. In other words, we were underdeveloped. Before we were uncivilized, now we're underdeveloped. Okay? And they said, okay, you just be quiet. Okay? We will bring development to you. They delinked systematically. It took about 20 years to do, during which quite some big achievements were achieved. You're quite right to say that. But they delinked the definition of African from being a people engaged in a struggle for emancipation. The moment you do that, all you're left with is a taxonomic definition. It's the same as what the South Africans did. They called an African somebody who's got this color skin, this size nose, this time hair, this time of ear, all this shit, okay? I mean, that's what our people did. And our leaders then redefine us, not as Africans, not even as Kenyans. We are not Kenyans. We are Luo, we are Kamba, we are Kikuyu, we are whatever. Huh? That's what we become. And so we are no longer united. We have no common struggle together. So we're no longer Africans. That's the problem. We are no longer Africans. And we have to seize back that desire, that organizing ability to become Africans. That is to say, a people who are united to bring about a universalist, inclusive humanity. People who are engaged in creating a new world of emancipation. That's what we will become Africans again. And so long as we define it racially, so long as we define it continentally or geographically, we're lost. It has to be in terms of its political ambition. That's the short answer.
Evan Camden. Listen, thank you very much, and for those of you who organised it as well, for a really, really interesting afternoon. I'm just going, by the way, just listening to the last speaker, I was thinking, and going back to something you said, quite often as an Irish person going away to somewhere like America, or indeed Australia is another example, I don't despair, because I do actually still feel proud to be Irish, because I find the non-white Irish, where the ones who did become the whites and take part in the whole system, there were equally others who didn't. And those are the ones that I try and look for, because that's the only thing you can do in order to keep yourself going, to keep being political within the world in which we live. And I love that thing about you talking about there's no such thing as African, and I was thinking about a great anthology of literature. I'm going back to literature here, done in South America, where the man who edited it said, there is, of course, no such thing as South American literature. How could there be? There's Venezuelan literature, there's Brazilian literature. It's a lazy, what he said, a lazy white man's term to say that. But anyway, I actually want to ask you a very brief question, and maybe to other people here. For those of us who are interested, and I'm sort of an annoyingly, continuously, happily political writer, even though I say it with a small p. Is there a particular place, because I don't trust Google, is there a particular place that we need to go to look for what any of you or anybody else here would consider Ogoni literature, either poetry, theatre, or fiction? That's the best.
Okay. 2 points there. I mean, I think we have to... The construct is those who choose whiteness. It's not being white. And whiteness implies a choice of which history you identify with. The history that made you think you were white and everyone else, or something else. And so I think distinction between being white and whiteness, which is a choice, is an important one. On the issue of Ogoni literature, I would have to pass my microphone to Helen or others who are expert on that literature. I cannot claim to be an authority on Ogoni literature, and so I'd find it very hard to answer your question.
Okay. Well, on that, and then, yourself and then Seamus, just to say, in the Ogoni language, we actually have an Ogoni Bible in our Russell Library Special Collections, but there would have been very little writing in the Ogoni language, and it's interesting that the Bible is the probably one of the few things that have been written in Ogoni, and that of course was done by the Bible Society when they went out to convert people. So we wouldn't have literature in Ogoni, but works like the works of Ken Saro-Wiwa, we would certainly have, Ferozie mentioned Sosa Boy, and his writings are listed in the back of the book that we have on sale today. But we would have all those in the library, and we are, as part of the exhibition, we're planning with the public libraries in Ireland. We've given Kildare Public Libraries a list of books by Saro-Wiwa, and we will be doing that for other places as well. Okay.
Does literature get defined when it gets written?
Yes, that's the question. Literature.
Is literature defined as something only when it gets written? You think humans... But humans have a capacity to imagine, to develop ideas, to engage in imagination, and that may or may not take a written form.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think culturally the singing and the dancing and that's all a part of all of our culture. But as I say, I'd obviously fight my own corner here for the pen as well.
And
yourself?
I mentioned No as well, No Saro-Wiwa,
Oh, yes.
and
That's
she's producing a work, she's actually currently working on a sort of word and image based sort of, it's almost like an autoethnography or something like that about Ogoni. She's interviewing people in Ogoni, so that's something to look forward to anyway. Yeah.
So that's No Saro-Wiwa who's putting together some material on that.
Yes, okay, and then I'll take you.
I would like to ask Samuel about this, because he comes from an ethnic culture which would be somewhat the same as Ogoni. So, you see, we're very tied to categories, and we can only think in categories. So, Samuel, how do you cope with this question? Or is it essential at all to think like this?
It is very essential, and I'm actually doing my research on the Ogoni people, and it's very difficult to get exactly what she's asking for.
Yeah, the categories.
Because I was in Ogoni and I did ask for an Ogoni literature, a book or something like that, but I never got one.
What about your own culture? What happens in that?
Now, even in my own culture now, we have to go back to anthropology. We have to go back really to those who really said, this is what my culture is, and to read that. That's why the oral
the oral, that's the oral is so important.
Yeah, it's very important.
We didn't always rely on the written ever, it's like your other categories.
Yeah.
Some categories don't exist.
Yourself and then Seamus, yeah.
Tom, as an Irish person, I consider myself, if I look honestly in the mirror, as a hybrid because of the cultures in the past that have been superimposed on whatever the original was. I've just wondered, in striving for the new world, or in searching for the new world that you describe, how important is it that we don't superimpose constructs and as such change the original cultures?
Well, my view is that culture is not static. It's constantly growing. It's constantly engaged and learning from that. And what we should be surely aspiring to is a culture that gives expression to a universalist humanity, which recognizes the diversity and the different contributions that different cultures make on our own. And I think that is such a rich, I mean, can you imagine? We haven't even begun the process of incorporating the cultures of all of humanity and what we could become. I think today our problem is that we are restricted by our capacity to imagine what the world could be. I think that's one of the great shortcomings we have. We have to constantly think, what would it mean? What would it mean if I could speak concurrently in Kiswahili, in Spanish, in Kijaluo, in whatever, that I could cite the stories from all these different cultures? What would it make me? It would transform me. It would make me something I don't even have the capacity to imagine what I would be. And I think that's, wow, what a thing to aspire to. Yeah? And that's what I mean by a universalist humanity. It's not exclusive. It's rich. It's, I can't think of the metaphor, but that's what I think it should be.
We have Seamus, and then maybe one more question. I know, well, there's two people. We'll take, Seamus, Ada, Regia.
Just a reminiscence. I've reached the age when I'm entitled to it. When I was a young student in anthropology in the United States, my mentor was an Andean specialist, and the Altiplano, the high Andes, Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, and so on, were noted for being extremely poor, seriously poor areas. And North America had many, many programs, including of action anthropology and applied anthropology, including from my own university. But this was the way to address development. My mentor, however, was an ethnohistorian, and what he was trying to do was to suggest that this was an area of the Inca Empire and the pre-Inca empires where they used all the resources of the various levels, from the desert up to the Altiplano, to use the resources and exchange resources, and it was an area of high civilization and tremendous self-consciousness. So his approach was culture, has a huge role that, if you like, reworking people's sense of themselves, their pride in themselves, in their cultures, was more important than thousands of development projects.
I completely agree. I'm afraid development is never been about emancipation. It's never been about freedom. It's about living with the world as it stays. And it starts with the conception that those who are not developed are underdeveloped. And I think we have to be careful with certain words we use. In my view, there is no such thing as poor people. There's no such thing as poverty. There is impoverishment. It's really important because it's not an ontological character. It's not static. Someone's poor. It's that poverty is created. It's perpetuated because that's the source of wealth. Why do you think people are so much richer now when so many more people are poorer? There's a direct relationship between those. And I think, we have to be clear about that. But also to recognize that in the conditions of impoverishment, there is a culture that also develops. And I think Sozoboy was about that too. It was about the alternative, the new world that's being created by the most disenfranchised, the most marginalized people. So I think it's important to recognize that those are happening. And yes, historically there are cultures which have been destroyed from which we still have to learn. And I think that's the richness that could be ours if we fought for it.
Ida.
Thanks a million, Rose, and thanks for modelling that sort of ways in which we use language even sort of opens up possibilities for us today. What you're doing in terms of talking about poverty and impoverishment and who is the resistance and the naming of the resistance and terrorism is really important. I'm struck by the earlier discussion. The thing that keeps coming into my head is when we think the sort of dream that you had, if I could speak Kiswahili, what stories could I tell, and how would they reshape me and my mind, my psychology, all of that. The challenge often, like neoliberalism has kind of appropriated those movements, right? And it has appropriated the liberalism, right? Of, you know, you can be who you want to be. And in opposition to that, if you look at sort of, let's say, forms of cosmopolitanism that existed in Africa before there was colonialism, you see that people had a kind of lived history of living together. But now we're, over generations, over centuries, now we're in a world where the sort of transnationalism that can happen, it happens through these social media, right, and through the internet and through these global frameworks, where often the super rich, these elites, have a huge advantage in terms of shaping how we think and how we can imagine, you know. So can you say a little bit about what the challenges are to make those two things meet, the lived experience of culture, which is, I think, the model that, even though Ken Saro-Wiwa was living a bit later than Cabral, he was talking about the Agomi people where their culture was contained in that area because they didn't have access to those technologies, you know. And so they're both thinking about culture in that sense, in the sense of a kind of people living together over time and knowing each other, as opposed to a different kind of world where culture is coming at us through technology. I think organising is going to be part of the answer, but could you say a bit more about that?
I mean, I think the impact of neoliberalism has been, one is to desocialize, to individualize. Margaret Thatcher said there is no such thing as society. It tries to achieve that, and it also, secondly, it eliminates history. A people without history are a people without a future. You know, if you want to dominate a people, you rewrite their history. You eliminate all their cultural products. And neoliberalism tries to do that. So I find myself, you know, in Kenya talking about the struggles that we had over the last 100 years. And young people have just no idea. They don't have access to the books, the stories, etc., in their schools. So there's a de-skilling, there's a de-schooling, there's a dehumanization that neoliberalism causes. And I think that's where what we have to understand is neoliberalism is a continuity in a new period of the traditions of liberalism. Let me explain. The Enlightenment was given birth to by the experience of massive capital accumulation through slavery, through sugar trade, through tobacco, whatever, this whole Atlantic. Okay, it gave birth to liberalism, but its conjoined twin of liberalism was racism. Okay, they were both born joined together and have never been able to separate. And so when democracy was given birth to in America, only white male slave owners could vote. Every single change that has occurred in liberalism since that time, every single change in democracy that has happened since that time, has been the result of the struggles we have fought. They have wanted to keep a sacred space for themselves, and the rest of us are in the profane. The profane have said, no, no, no. Women have said, no, we want the vote. Black people have said, we want the vote. All sorts of movements have arisen to make claims on the space created by liberalism. And neoliberalism is an attempt to go back to that. You know, it's not surprising Trump talks about some non-existent past. Okay, make America great again. What he means is make America white again. Make America a slave owner's white. It's back to liberalism. So let's dispense with this idea that, you know, neoliberalism is bad, let's go back to liberalism. It was the same poison. So what we have to do is to say, no, there is no way back. So what is the new future? What is the new world that we want to create? That is not a continuity of that racist history of liberalism or neoliberalism.
Thank you, Rosie. I'll take Rich Connolly, and this will have to be the last comment. Magella and Eddie are speaking next, but Rosie will be staying with us through the reception, etc., so there will be plenty of opportunity to talk with them. Rich.
Thanks, Helen. Thank you so much for an absolutely wonderful food for the mind. And I suppose in many ways I couldn't agree more with regards to the connections between liberalism and neoliberalism and of course populism. But I suppose as an old hippie and feminist and all of these when you see what happens as social movements really try to develop a new vision, a new imagination for a new world, we always have to be very careful about our allies in these endeavours, because sometimes we are all too human and carry our old prejudice with us into our new vision, and I suppose that is something that we have seen in with every sort of like step forward. We also have stepped backwards. So I suppose when we're talking about that culture is so important in terms of this new world, how do we develop that insight and awareness so as that we don't in turn become the oppressors that we have overcome in order to get to this place?
And the answer is 42, I think was the last time somebody answered that one. I think that we are human, and everyone around us are human, and that means that we have a variety of strengths and weaknesses, and in any new world we try to create, we will bring with us our history, like albatrosses around our necks, okay? Of course we'll do that. But it is in the struggle to engage in creating a new world that we have the opportunity to have a conversation in a way which, sitting in an armchair, you can't. It is because it means something to us at that moment. And it is in struggle that we learn how to think. And I mean, I'll give you a concrete example. I was stunned at the time of the Tunisian uprising. I met with somebody who was called himself a revolutionary from Tunisia, and he said to me, "Let's just watch what's going on in the square there. Okay, you see that guy standing there speaking?" And I said, "Yeah." And he says, he was in the same university as I was. He was reactionary. He was unwilling to engage in any politics. Look at him. He's transformed. He's transformed because the struggle transformed him. And I think that we have to welcome that diversity and that engagement, because in a struggle, that's where we will learn, because we carry prejudices too. Except me, huh?
Thank you so much, Rosie. That was a truly wonderful talk. And wonderful engagement from the audience. Now, next we have Sister Magella McCarran and Eddie Mitchell who want to address the gathering. So would you like to come up here because you need the microphone? And following that, we have 2 school prize winners here, I believe, at the back. So Sister Magella will present their prizes. I'll bring you
Thank
onto
you.
that.
Yeah. I'm sorry, it has been a long afternoon. I can appreciate that very much. I just thought, because this time of the year is the memorial time for the death of Ken Saro-Wiwa, and I just wanted to recall what happened in Dublin on the 10th of November in '95. And it was a poem that I wrote that night because we had gathered at the Nigerian embassy to beg for his life when the word came through that the hangings had taken place. So what we had was not a vigil, but a wake. And this is what we wrote. Large sobs of rain, gusts of pain, flowed along the lane of Ken Saro-Wiwa Park. Memoriam streamed along the lane, umbrella shrouds unrolled your precious name in the deepest dark. I'd brought you home, given you a place to be mourned until freed to your own. Waked in Ireland on a street of shame, renamed and washed with Ireland's rain. We took the name of Leeson Street down off the wall and we put up a plaque, Ken Saro-Wiwa Park. So that is what happened on that day. The other little point there was the people were absolutely forbidden to gather in more than twos in Ogoni those days. So that was, we brought you home, waked until you could be waked by your own. There are so many people to thank. When I handed the archives, or what became the archives, to Maynooth University Library 7 years ago, I thought the task was well and truly over, but the story has continued going on. And one of the ways it has gone on, and which I would like to remember this year, is through the other grassroots community groups that also fight the oppressor, as we now know. So I would remember Shell to Sea, and Terence is here from there today. And the people who are not here are the Greencastle people in County Tyrone, who are struggling with a whole plethora of mining companies up there. So they're the transnationals at work. And I have with me somebody that gave me a great welcome in their area from Love Leitrim. So I said, let him share with me my couple of minutes to speak to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Sister Magella. We appreciate you in Leitrim very much. I think you stirred up a lot of trouble in Mayo, and then you got bored and came up and stirred it up with us. And that's the honest truth. That story that I've heard this evening, it's actually a little bit like our story, you know. I'm a farmer in North Leitrim. You know, you talk about struggle. People do struggle, and you know, it was always said in our house, you know, how are you doing? And we said, well, I'm struggling, you know. And we in the west of Ireland, I think we learned to struggle, and we don't mind struggling because we love where we are. You know what I mean? But I want to tell you a little bit about our story, about our own struggle, and a little bit about how it's continuing, because. Even though we banned fracking, actually that struggle is continuing, and I think people forget that. I think so. Going back to around 2011, we realised that we were living in a gas basin. We didn't really know that we were living in a gas basin, but people from Rossport who had been dealing with Shell came to Manorhamilton, and they told us that our area had been licensed and that we should look up fracking. And man, we were in for a shock, you know. So it kind of forced us into a funny position. So as that news got out, the gas company had to come and explain what that meant. And we were surprised to see a gas company coming with nobody else There was no government minister. There were just a gas company organised a room like this, and they said, we're going to drill 9,000 wells in this area. It's worth 90 billion, and we're going to spend 6 billion over the next 15 years. We didn't know whether that was good or bad, but we knew it was a shock, and we knew hadn't been told before, and we tried to find out what's all of this about, how long is it going to take, what's going to happen. And the answer to those questions was lots of technical information. But also, we didn't do this, go ask your government. They asked us to come here. And when we went to government, we were met with silence. And we even noticed that people who worked for the government, who had state jobs, were told not to speak about fracking. It was to be a taboo. And the national media had no interest in it. They told us, oh, when it starts, we might come and have a look. £6 billion project in Leitrim, and nobody wants to talk about it. So we were forced to ask the question, who runs this place? You're talking about Africa and different places. Ireland is a young state, but we presumed we had independence and that we had governance and that we had sovereignty. But it seemed that when we looked at the legislation, which was written back in the 60s, that we were one political decision away from an exploration licence. They had got temporary licences. We were one decision away from an exploration licence that granted rights of access over our land, on the basis that the licence meant that the company was operating on behalf of the state to take out petroleum to sell it back to the state. All we were entitled to was some notice and minimum maybe compensation. Now, I want to try and figure out where I'm going with that. So that was our reality. So we went from being a normal rural community to that reality. And that's the reality that you're talking about in Africa. And I remember at one particular stage, somebody from Shell came to visit. They were genuine, I think. They came with their daughter. She was doing research. And we sat down, as we did with everybody, and we told them our story. And he said, when we had the discussions, like all those discussions, he said, in order for us to live like we do in the West, people have to crawl around in the dirt. And I answered that question by saying, well, those people have to fight against that, and you'll find that we will fight against that here. So I think there was massive lesson in that for us about the way we live in the world, but also about how we all of a sudden had become the focus of this, this, because we lived in a gas field. But so we struggled with that. It forced us to figure out why we had moved back to Leitrim, what it was that we loved about Leitrim. All of a sudden we couldn't be quiet. We had to explain to the world what our vision was for our county, how we wanted to see our children and our future, and measure that against what the other future was. So we developed a culture. So our culture had to come back to support us. And that was very important. People were introducing me to artists and singers, and I couldn't recognise them. I thought everybody looked the same because I'm not in that world. But all of that world came to us and became our base and support. So we worked with our politicians, we educated ourselves, we started to we went back to the communities like people in Rossport, and because they were the people that told us. And we went back and we spoke to them, and we found people in America that were being fracked, and we talked to those communities. And then we realised that the frame that the companies were talking to us was not the right frame, and the frame was actually about sovereignty, democracy, public health, and was really about the new vision. What's your vision for where you're going to be? So it took us 6 years, but we achieved a ban last year on fracking. We understand that the company that got through the first part of the process still owns the first right to the gas in our area. So if somebody ever decides, strong government walks in and changes their mind and says that Leitrim's open for fracking, or the Northwest Carboniferous Basin, then they will still own that gas. Somebody may own it somewhere. So we're never safe from that. But it actually emboldened us in Leitrim. So we started to look around and we started to say, well, what's going on here? Why are we so poor? You know, why is this area remained undeveloped while other areas didn't? And okay, first of all, we have to take responsibility ourselves for that. But what we noticed was that the place is filling up with forestry. So at the moment in Leitrim, 19% of the county is covered in forestry. So in a way, they're getting ready already for the next time. The people were able to stop them this time. But we're in a kind of a rural economic collapse in that you can't get planning permission to build a house in Leitrim. And what we see is, 100% state funding to remove people from rural Ireland and impose forestry in the guise of climate change. So what we understand about climate change is that climate action has to be equitable. And to use climate action to remove people from a future gas basin isn't equitable from our point of view. So we see the depopulation of our county, which I think we can trace back beyond when we knew about oil and gas, back to when my parents were children. My parents told me, we have to get you educated, and I wanted to be a farmer, but this is really difficult, you know. The best thing that you could do is get out, get educated, and maybe if you want to come back then, but get out, get away, which is what most people did. But not everybody goes away. Most of us come back because we realise the value. When we leave, we realise the value of where we are. So we're still struggling. So we see what we're trying to do now, our movement has become a movement of change, really. People are tired. We worked very hard for 6 years, but we're starting to build again. We're starting to think about democratising our natural resources, so our wind energy. We want to see community-owned resources. We want to see money coming to Minor Hamilton, our North Leitrim, and turning around and going around in a circle in our rural economy instead of leaving and us becoming just something at the side. We're also part of, I'm not going to talk for a long time, you'll have to ask questions, but we're also recognising that what's happening in America and what's happening with climate change. And we see frack gas going to be imported now into Ireland. And that has there are many excuses for that, but we understand that if frack gas gets back into the energy mix in Ireland, that it won't take long until we become the focus of that again. It'll be, well, why wouldn't we use our own frack gas instead of importing frack gas from America? So our struggle, we had a major victory, and then we had silence again. So we see the government not willing to talk about what it did when they banned fracking. We see instead silence. We see more depopulation, more rural decline, and we see just finding a different way for the oil and gas industry to come in and be part of our world. But we're not the resistance. We're the people, as you said, who are trying to imagine our future and create that for our children. And we are doing that, and we are struggling. And thanks very much for that.
Eddie will be staying with us, so there'll be an opportunity to ask him questions and talk to him, for those who haven't met him. We have two more prize winners from the school poetry competition with us now, so I'm going to call on Magella McCarran to present second prize, a book token for €70, to Sophia. Will you come forward, please?
I'm going to give you one of the lines from her poem. Only heroes can save us now. So strong, yet so shatterable. There are two different lines from her poem. Only heroes can save us now. So strong, yet so shatterable.
You have an opportunity to read all of the winning poems because we'll be putting them up on our website as well. Great. And our runner-up, Mia Burns, if you come forward, please. Mia was met.
Yes, here. Did I read out the wrong one, the first one? And we have to give a line from your poem as well. Killing the beauty of earth, our earth too precious.
I'm now going to call on our librarian, Cathal McCauley, to launch the new edition of Silence Would Be Treason.
Thanks very much, Helen. And it's not often, I think, that the book launch almost feels like a kind of afterthought, but we've had such a interesting and inspiring and thought-provoking afternoon today. I think it does a little bit, but I'm sure that's in the best sense time. Thank you to Feroza and to Eddie and to everyone who spoke, and of course to the fantastic poets from Maynooth Post Primary and from the Education Campus. So well done. It's a great honour to be asked to launch this book, and I was really humbled when Helen approached me about to do it. I was humbled by so many things. I think this afternoon probably gives you a flavour of that. But particularly by the courage and resilience shown by the Ogoni people, by the determination of Sister Magella and many others to tell their story, and by the dynamism of Helen, who since the deposition of the archive 7 years ago has worked tirelessly to promote it, share it and cultivate engagement with it. So well done to everyone. Thank you in particular to the editors, to Ida, Helen, Lawrence and to the publisher, and of course Sister Magella for this privilege. I'm very grateful. In 2013, we had the privilege of welcoming Ken's brother, Dr. Saro-Wiwa, to the university to launch the first edition of Silence Would Be Treason, Last Rising of Ken Saro-Wiwa. The book contained letters and poems. It is an excellent example of how our library's unique and distinctive collections can be used to underpin and advance scholarship. In addition to the printed book, the publisher has created a very high quality e-book which went on open access via Mural, the Maynooth University Research Archive Library, in late 2016. And within the first year alone, it was downloaded nearly 700 times. And I'm pleased to say that the electronic version of the second edition, which is only available for a week, has been downloaded many times already from all over the globe. It is really wonderful to be able to provide this free of charge to communities, researchers, activists and others, though it is on sale today for €10 over there. Today it is my pleasure to launch a second edition. In addition to the material included in the first edition, the new edition includes a chapter by Graham Kay. So there was a reference made to him earlier. He was the first recipient of the Ken Saro-Wiwa bursary. And in this chapter, he describes the research he was able to carry out in Germany thanks to the bursary. This is about oil, pre-World War I and so on. And he's planned to use the sales from the funds arising from the sale of the second edition to continue to fund that bursary, and also from the movie rights that Helen referred to earlier. So this archive has taken us all sorts of places that we never thought we'd be when we met Magella 7 years ago. It's an absolutely wonderful journey. Other new material in the second edition is a foreword contributed by Saro-Wiwa and an afterword by Mark Dummett. And again, those of you who come to this event on an annual basis, remember Mark was here last year. Again, Helen mentioned him earlier. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it today. But Mark was our keynote speaker from Amnesty International in London last year, and he also has an afterword in this second edition of the book. And there's a new chapter in the book about the Ken Saro-Wiwa Audio Archive, which Anne O'Brien and Helen Fallon collaborated on, and there's many images as well from the large collection of in the archive that have been processed as the first edition. So, without further ado, and after a long, and engaging afternoon, it's my pleasure to declare the book and the ebook launched, and just to remind everyone that many of our speakers, including Eddie, Feroza and others, are here for the remainder of the afternoon, so please feel free to ask me questions, and well done again to all involved. Cógordagus agus míle buíochas.